G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day, and so far you're having a fantastic week as well. Now you've probably seen that this video is longer than usual. They tend to get longer and longer, but the reason for the length today is I've had a number of my sources from all over reach out to me and give me information that I can share with you today. Information about censorship in Ukraine from someone in Ukraine. Information about Mr. Oscar Jenkins, of course, the Australian who was taken prisoner by the Russian forces, who is feared dead. I have information on that as well. But a side note on that Glenn, of course, an international military lawyer, was going to come on today and speak with us. Now, that is still going to happen, but there are very large storms where he lives, and the internet is basically completely out. But hold off, we will get that, but we have from another source, also a source to talk about the problems within the German army to do with NATO, the AFD party we've seen, who have made also some claims, and some of the security risks that are actually going on there too, and how this is all related to a lot of the hybrid war we talk about. Of course, we're going to look over negotiations, what Putin may demand, what the incoming US administration is saying. We'll look at the maps and we'll talk about strikes. So there is a lot to go over today, so let's get stuck into it. Now, always on this, I don't know where to start, but let's just start somewhere. Let's start with missile and UAV attacks, and this is increasing, and this isn't a surprise to see that this is increasing. So overnight, now it can get a little bit weird for me because I'm in such a different time zone. Sometimes the nights and everything can all sort of blend into one. But overnight, Ukraine has had a UAV attack, so a drone attack against Russian oil depots as well. And you can see that a number of these tanks are on fire. To assess the damage, we cannot assess it from here because, of course, this is a highly flammable substance. It often looks significantly worse than when we get the satellite imagery. So wait on that, and when and if that comes, I will then share that with you. But we also saw that Russia carried out a large missile and UAV attack on Ukraine last night. And we'll look at what that was targeting and some very rare footage of this also. But this came from fighter bomber, and this gives us an idea of how these attacks are working, and this shouldn't come as a surprise to you. The Russian armed forces are currently carrying out a combined MOU, otherwise a massive missile strikes against targets on the territory of Ukraine. As is already traditional, the attack included drones of all types, including decoys in the first wave. So, of course, these decoy drones go in and that will tie up the air defense. The second wave included cruise and ballistic missiles of air, sea, and land basing. So things like Iskanders from the land, some Kalibrs from the sea and air, of course your KH-101s and KH-59s, missiles like that, and there were a number of them. It's very difficult to get, one, a number of how many were fired and an exact types, and secondly, what was actually intercepted. We know that one of the stories of this war, whether from Kyiv or whether from Moscow, is that debris do the absolute most amount of damage to oil depots in Russia or energy facilities in Ukraine. Judging by the inclusion of emergency power outage modes in some regions of Ukraine, the targets again could traditionally include objects of the Ukrainian energy system. And we can look at where a lot of these missiles went, and a lot of these went into the west of the country, of course, in and around Lviv, targeting energy and gas storage, and of course, trying to limit this crossing from EU into Ukraine. So a number of targets there. There were other targets from other medium range, such as Iskanders, as well. You can see, I believe this is one out in here. Maybe I'm incorrect on that, but there was a large attack overnight. This is said to be one of those ones in Lviv. Now, you can hear this coming in. And then just at the top of your screen here, this is blurred out not to get a really good geolocation, but we can see an impact there and explosion. So it's hard to exactly know what was hit. Anything with these missiles, whether it is coming from Kyiv, whether it's coming from Moscow, whether it's coming from me, unless there is footage of it impacting, grain of salt this large, please, because it's so hard to know. And of course, there's going to be a lot of informational war just around these. And the next thing I want to talk about is Turk Stream. Now, one of my sources, and this isn't one source, these are many different sources, and you can probably see the app being used here, but unrelated to something else we'll talk about. But if Ukraine tries hitting Turk Stream, I suspect Russian warships will suddenly find that they can cross the Dardanelles and Bosphorus without any issue. So, of course, what we know is one of Russia's main ways to finance, continue financing the war, is oil and gas. And of course, that gas has been switched off that did transit Ukraine into Slovakia, causing a lot of both political and energy problems. Of course, the gas by the Nord Stream flowing into the EU was cut off by a mystery ghost explosion, and that there is Turk Stream pipeline running underneath the Black Sea, of course, which Ukraine border, and that, of course, is running into Turkey, across into Europe, and supplying billions of dollars back to Russia in gas. And we have spoken about, could this be a target? And Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, has said that Ukraine has tried to target it. What we know, Turkey would not be happy about this. Turkey is in NATO, not in the EU. NATO can limit Turkey's response somewhat, but Turkey can veto NATO responses as well, or further aid as well as acceptance for Ukraine. So there is even an element of this, and I don't believe this because of the financial supply, the money to Russia, but could there even be maybe some type of false flag here? Again, we do not know. But what he is saying here is, of course, those Russian warships can't go through the Bosphorus. Warships cannot cross there, but maybe Turkey will turn more of a blind eye to this. Potentially, will we see that pipeline have a mystery explosion? Well, we may. And if nothing comes of that explosion, then it points to who then blew it up. But this is something that we've spoken about more and more, and something when I'm saying that if we're near the end of the war or we're near major shifts, what we're going to see. And I can't remember who this player was, and I'll share it with you, but this is off another one of my sources. This is from a professional gamer. He gives the following advice to newish players on like a strategic game. If you're losing, if your opponent is stronger and pushing you back on the main battlefield and you don't know what to do, make it messy. Stop focusing on the main battlefield. Try attacking your opponent in their home base. Maybe they don't have much military there. Maybe they get confused and start panicking or making mistakes. Maybe you get a chance and turn the tide and win the game. But make it messy. Stop focusing on the main battlefield if you are being pushed back on the main battlefield. And this is something I've spoken about at length, both in the informational space and potential for false flag attacks as well. Now, on my strikes, I've put in this as well. Now, this is actually older footage being shared back around today. And as you can see, well, I wonder who people are claiming these soldiers are. Of course, just black dots. We can't zoom in and see if it's Asian appearance or not. But let's take for a second that this is North Koreans as is being reported. This, to me, as a former infantryman, this is not human wave tactics. This is infantry dismounted movements. It's not perfect. Infantry dismount movements are never perfect. Even infantry mounted movements is not perfect. But what do you really do in a drone and artillery war like this? You're out in the open. But this, to me, doesn't constitute human wave tactics. And you could say that all infantry attacks in some way are human wave. And J_J Helen, who you should be following on this, does some great maps as well. He points out that this is from December, and it's still not a meat wave, but a relatively normal platoon attack drill. And from me watching this as a former infantryman who have done hundreds of platoon attacks, company attacks, section attacks, bloody all in between, I agree with him on this. And he goes, I would say that a human wave attack is the kind of attack where the attacker is attempting to overwhelm the defender by sheer weight of numbers and momentum. If traditional small-level infantry actions were meat waves, then all coordinated infantry attacks are meat waves. And he's correct on this, that I guess in a sense, just a traditional section platoon attack movement up onto position, is that a meat wave where you are running towards positions, firing and movement with your boys, dancing afterwards if you've seen Shane Gillis. But I guess it's in that. But I get what he's getting at. It's trying to overwhelm by just sheer numbers and momentum. And what I will say is in this war, and I follow this so closely, I have not seen what I would consider by the Russian armed forces or by the Ukrainian armed forces, what I would consider a meat wave attack of what they're trying to point to in this. Meat wave, human wave, whatever. Even if someone is going to argue the meat wave does not refer to human wave attacks envisioned in World War I and II and the Korean War, well, I disagree. Using the term absolutely conjures the classic image from a popular consciousness, and it's trying to sell that idea. So that's just my 2 cents on it. I know that History Legends, he did a video on this as well and explained it better than I, but he actually used some of my sources on that video as well. So maybe go back and have a watch of this. Now let's talk about Mr. Oscar Jenkins, who still fingers crossed that he's okay, but We know the governments, for official sources, are looking for more information around this, and all the media, of course, has picked up and said that he was executed. We spoke about this yesterday, and one of my contacts on the ground in Ukraine has said this. At this point in time, I have to keep some parts of this. I've cropped out some parts. More will come as we go. Willie, I watch your channel for updates along other sectors across the Ukrainian Eastern Front in general. I'm an American citizen serving here since 22. I've found that you've been by far the most thorough and honest. Appreciate the coverage you provide. Well, apparently, according to the internet, I just work for the Russian SVR or FSB or something. So, mate, I appreciate that. Thank you. Aussie, Oscar Jenkins, was a good friend of mine. 2 days ago, the brigade received his body and was identified. Single shot to the head. He was, in fact, executed. Just thought you might want to know from someone on the ground around him. I'd rather leave out my call sign, as this is still an internal matter as of the moment. No official releases I've heard of yet for some reason or another. The fella's set out his flag on Maidan. You can share the photo of. You can share that photo if you want. I also asked if I could share this as well, and that was okay. And Mr. Oscar Jenkins from the 66th Mech Brigade. If you're not a vegan, you will be soon. So, look, it's looking like Mr. Jenkins, who was under the care of the Russian forces or under the protection at that time, being a POW, someone who has signed a contract, has lost his life. Anything more in this? Well, I'm going to speak to Glenn and we'll wait for official announcements, and maybe if we see some of the footage or whatever come of that. With everything, I always say beyond reasonable doubt. And I had a chat back and forward with my friend there as well about that situation and how, look, I need to be on the side of beyond reasonable doubt in all this, and he agreed with me. So thank you very, very much. Now, before we get into the maps, I want to talk about another one of my contacts who is in Ukraine at the moment, who has sent me over this. Now, there's a lot of people in my encrypted chats at the moment. Kyiv passed a law today banning critique online on social media. The security services will be monitoring and requiring online sites to remove any certain comments if they are critical in any way to Kyiv. He says, you can't make this stuff up. And I said, well, can you link me to that? And he sent me across to this page here, Place Kharkiv. Obviously a Ukrainian page here, raising money and showing about Kharkiv as well. Of course, if you don't know where Kharkiv is, Kharkiv sits up here, Kharkiv Oblast. Russia occupy some of that. We're going to talk about that in a sec. But the post they put up that he was referring to is this. According to law, media shall be required to delete readers' comments with accusations of officials within 3 working days from receiving a complaint or appropriation of the National Council or resolution to open appropriate proceedings. So what he is talking about, if there's then comments or accusations around officials, things like corruption, things whatever, it has to be removed within 3 days. Further censorship on this, and you know what I've said about nearing the end of wars, propaganda increases and censorship. I spoke about that when we saw Deep State Map, who are going to go over, censored for a couple of days. Online media will be relieved of responsibility for negative comments from readers if they are removed within 3 days of receiving a court order or complaint or National Council's assignment. The relevant Bill 11321, initiated by the chairman of the Pokrovsk Kurakhove Committee of Freedom of Speech, Yaroslav Urichin, on January 14th, adopted the Pokrovsk Kurakhove. Again, if you're on the Committee of Freedom of Speech, this doesn't sound exactly like that, buddy. Yes, the rule of Article 117 of the law on media is specified. It states that entities in the sphere of online media are released from responsibility for the dissemination of unauthorised information, as well as information prohibited by the dissemination provided for in Articles 36, 42 and 119 of this Act. If such information has been disseminated by users in the comment sections or posting user publications on the website or web page of such media for terms that entity in the sphere of online media has restricted access to such information within 3 working days from time of receiving a relevant complaint or assignment of the National Council or an order to open the appropriate course proceedings. So, of course, this is impossible because it's in your comments of a large page. Geez, like imagine you're a Ukrainian blogger in Ukraine the size of me. If you look, I get 600, 700, 800 comments sometimes. How am I meant to filter this? So to my current editorial office is attached to the rule of media must delete comments within 3 days of receiving court's verdict. Information stating a person's violation of, namely the rules of current law, committing any other act, violation of moral principles, general rules of coexistence, unethical conduct in personal, social, political life should be considered negative, and which the opinion of the plaintiff violates his right to respect for dignity, honour, or business reputation. But this is freedom of speech and freedom of movement. It does not mean that you're free from consequence of that. So the question arises is whether online media should delete any comments from readers claiming corruption or other negative characteristics. For example, officials. And if comments, media, whoever can't call out corruption, well, you know what I will say. That the best disinfectant is sunlight. And my God, we need some bloody sunlight. So let's move on to the maps, and we have a lot to go over. So of course, here is Ukraine in the center of your screen, of course, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. So let's zoom down and we will see there is red check. What this red check is showing is where Russia has had movements over the past 24 hours. We can see some of that, but before we get into that, I want to go over what Zelensky has said about numbers, and this is telling us somewhat about some Russian tactics as well. And this was from Ukrainian media. Defending the entire territory, Zelensky discloses the number of Ukrainian troops. He also disclosed the number of casualties as well, and we know what everyone thought about that, including people on the ground. So today, the Ukrainian army has 880,000 men. There are about 600,000 Russian troops. Because the defence forces defend the entire country, the enemy has a numerical advantage in some parts of the front line. So saying that we are almost 200,000 more, but because we're defending everywhere and they're just pushing in some spots, they have the advantage, but still moving rearwards. So that border move and move and move, and we hear acute manpower shortages all over. Saying, today there are 600,000, a little more Russian troops in the territory of our state. Maybe a little less depending on how well our guys perform today. As for the Ukrainian army, it currently stands at 880,000. But 880,000 defending the entire territory, the Russian forces are concentrated in certain directions. This sounds like Brusilov offensives, and we'll talk about this. But we need to talk about, yes, there may be X amount, but how many are actually on the front line, or the second line, third line, back in logistics, on AD systems? History Legends, again, has spoken about there are huge numbers, but there are a hell of a lot who don't want to be on the front line, who may be avoiding the front line, who are paying money not to be in those frontline units also. And what we hear again and again acute shortages in the infantry. We know for a fact, because Zelensky confirmed it by talking about it, that Air Force staff are being moved across to the infantry. So 880,000 troops, I don't know about that figure, but what we do know is if that figure is correct, then they're all second, third line, the majority, because the frontline infantry is absolutely massively limited in numbers. But I spoke about the Brusilov offensive, and what Zelensky says in this is they 880,000 are defending, so these are the Ukrainian troops. The Russian forces are concentrated in certain directions. And this sounds exactly like in summer of 1916, the Brusilov offensive. And basically what this was to push on various points of the enemy's entrenched lines, not on one given point. And you have small breakthroughs in many different areas. And it was assumed prior to this that you'd point through a single point, you'd exploit out from there. But the problem with doing that, if you point on one area, you go just push and Robotny, is that then the enemy can put all their resources there to stop that. So you want to push on many different sectors. And this goes into all the attritional protracted warfare doctrine you and I go over as well. So it sounds like that if we pull out those numbers and take those as fact. But at this point in time, grain of salt with everything. So let's have a look at this. So we'll zoom in. Actually, let's zoom in on Velika Novosilka. Now, this has updated to what we know to be correct, both of geolocations, both of other maps. Of course, it showed this lone little bit of red out here, but we come up today and the Russian forces have stepped up, showing today a gain of approximately 3.1 kilometers. Now, this isn't a new gain. I believe this is a couple of days old, but this is confirmed with a geolocation of drones targeting troops extracting wounded soldiers right out of this area here as well. So that is squeezing and squeezing on Velika Novosilka as we speak. But then I want to just ignore Kurakhove for a second, come up into Pokrovsk. And this shows that the Russians have then moved and exploited beyond these supply routes into Pokrovsk city itself and pushed out from Solone. Now, we'll have a quick look at the maps and then I want to talk about how important this is on another area. So this is pushing out from Solone and just to the south as well, using then the train line here. Now that train line was critical all the way back to Seledove, as well as further pushes out towards Pokrovsk. But as far as massively different, we're not going to nitpick this today. I want to talk about something that we spoke about a few days ago. So let's actually go backwards on this. I shared this a couple of days, that the embattled city of Pokrovsk is Ukraine's only mine that produced coking coal needed for the country's once giant steel-making industry, which has withered since Russia's February 2022 invasion. Of course, this is second industry behind agriculture. And the problem with this mine, it's the only one producing coking coal. And this has come out today, I believe, by the New York Times, if my memory is correct. By mid-December, Mr. Telegan and his colleagues knew this second front was collapsing. Russian troops had advanced to within a mile of shaft number 3, raising fears they might capture it and exploit its tunnels to outflank Ukrainian positions. In response, the miners working with the military began drilling holes beneath the shaft to place explosives, according to several workers. A few days later, around December the 20th, the shaft was blown up, saying everything collapsed and now it's rock. You and I spoke about this with mines. Of course, this one is not the one we're speaking about then the other day, but in the same direction. There's multiple different mines here saying that the Ukrainians may blow that up on withdrawal out of here. But these are incredibly critical to the economy as well. The Metinvest manager, who requested anonymity because he was not authorised to speak, said explosives had also been placed in the facility's 2 other shafts further west, near the villages of Kotliny and Udachi, which remain under Ukrainian control. Today, it is unclear if they have already been detonated. We do not know yet, but I believe it is this mine here, and this is that one we've spoken about it being very critical for then that coking coal to make steel, of course, a massive industry. From 7,000 tonnes of coal a day this summer, production fell to just 2,000 tonnes by mid-December. Mr. Kalenkov, a steel expert, said the mine's closure put Ukraine in a precarious situation. He expects a strain on an already fragile economy, but also cutbacks in defence industry projects, such as the production of armour for Patriot systems. The loss of the mine definitely hinders Ukraine's combat capabilities. Also, the resources that Russia would gain if they are able to take this mine. Now, it may be exploded. I don't know what the process is there. If you re-mine something that may be open cut, I have no idea about mining. But this area is very, very important, and we may see those mines then collapsed on purpose. I think it's highly likely we will see that. That doesn't scream winning on the front line to myself. Now, this is where some of the maps just east of Pokrovsk can look then a lot different. And we're looking at Baranivkia around here, and we can see this intersection right here that we've spoken about is very, very important. Now, today, what this is showing is this is said paddock right here. Now, remember, Syriac had to confirm his position on this, as he was somewhat incorrect about this intersection being cut off, but we did follow up with that as well. But he's saying that down to where these areas are in here is at this point in time then under Russian control. So showing vastly different, but wait out on this for further confirmation, as well as I'll keep my eyes open for geolocations here. And if I don't see it, please try and bring it to my attention. One thing I have to remember, because it's written in my notes and I always missed it because it's not in blue or green on this map, is just to the west of Solone in Uspanivkia here, that Ukraine has said to improve its positions here, and a pushback of then the Russian control here, expansion of grey zone through Uspanivka. So we need to keep that in mind. I almost missed that. Then we'll come down, of course, into what was the second Uspanivkia pocket, now the Dashny Ulaki pocket, of course, threatening Andrivkia and Constantinople as well. We see an increase of checked ground here by then the Russian forces. Let's open up the map in this direction, the Syriac map, and we can see that there has been confirmation across both maps of Russia crossing the waterway down in here that may have been acting as a barrier and further pushes. That Syriac is not showing the advancement that the deep state is. And if the deep state is showing more advancement by the Russian forces than the Syriac, I'd believe that map due to intrinsic bias. Does that make sense? So let's continue moving our way up and down the maps. We've shown you all of this, and then we'll come into Toretsk. Now, just a small movement here, but again, Syriac is showing that the majority of Toretsk has come under occupation. So we have a look here. Russian army captured this complex at the outskirts of the 12th district, so up in the north. We can just line up where this spoil of dirt is right in here. The Russian forces entered the first parts of this mine, so the mining up in here, and of course out to the west area too. Sorry, this is at the outskirts of the 12th district, and this is the mine. But the majority of Donetsk, according to Syriac, is coming under control. This is a very important area, especially to the southwest of here, down in here, of course, if some of these roads come under occupation. So move our way up just a little bit into Chasiv Yar. No changes shown on this map today. We know there's a lot of fluidity on this front line. We open up this, and he is showing, Syriac Maps is showing in Novia district in here that the Russian army has taken control over here. So we've already seen this on Deep State, but just confirming on his map there as well. And then we can confirm that movement. Move our way north more, and what we're looking for is Makivka. So we look in on Makivka here. Now, this is one of the areas that I think these maps show the most different. So we zoom in Makivka, you can just see where this is already dramatically different. You can see this paddock here is this paddock right out into somewhat of these areas. So let's go just very rough from the front line, almost 2 kilometers different, and showing that Russians have had a further push to the north. This is where this road comes down. So we're all up around this sector here. Again, we'll wait for any confirmations. I'll keep an eye out. Then we come up Pishani front line. What we're looking at is this tree line here to give ourselves something to work off and somewhere to look. And that's some ground in and around here has come under further occupation by the Russian forces today. So before we get into negotiations, I want to talk about something else very interesting that I've sent across and really does relate to a lot of the hybrid warfare and problems within the EU and just differences and divisions that we are seeing growing as well. And this is from another source. Again, when you talk about non-nuclear powers having to gravitate towards a centre of gravity, the AFD, of course, the right-wing party in Germany, wants Germany to resume economic and political ties with Russia, restart Nord Stream gas lines, kick the US military out of Germany, and go all in on the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is something we saw that party talk about. They want to reopen Nord Stream. They want to kick out any gender studies professors out of university. And of course, what I've spoken about is if you're not a major nuclear power, you need to come into the centre of gravity or the gravitational pull of one of those. So, of course, your NATO states are really in the gravity of the US, and other states may gravitate towards Russia. And we've seen where things are changing, and some of these Eastern European states like Hungary may be rethinking where their pull actually is. Again, I don't know, but I think the EU's continuation into the future is going to get more and more difficult. We will see. It seems the AFD have chosen which centre of gravity they want to be pulled in by. Domestically, the AFD have a very solid German-first policy, which is understandable in this current setting and gets them a lot more votes. However, their international policies will see Germany geographically isolated and in the middle of NATO community. And frankly, if they took power somehow, I would not be surprised if there was a military coup, as I don't see the Bundeswehr playing along with the AFD policies. The Bundeswehr is full of nationalists, as any army is. And of course, as soon as people say nationalists in Germany, people are thinking of bloody old mate mustache. But no, the armies attract nationalists. Why do you think guys sign up to go in the military and bloody storm a trench? But they are not willing to give in the bricks, despite having a number of Russian-speaking infantry battalions. So will we see movement just for NATO? What changes will we see here? And this guy's an expert in this. We'll go over more of this. But despite having a number of Russian-speaking infantry battalions, we'll talk over that in a second, or a lot of the speakers in there, at least with their heritage. Long story short, but there's a running joke that some battalions have German as a second language. Remember, a joke, but many a true word spoken in jest. I also don't see Poland taking the AFD-run Germany well. They'd see 1939 all over again. And when we saw AFD the other day, I said it looks like Germany's getting the old crew back together. And I said, also, can the AFD take up government, or do they need to form a coalition? The AFD would need to get an absolute majority of votes to take power. Other parties can feasibly form government if they have 40%, but if AFD has less than 50% of the votes, they would have to coalition, and currently no party is willing to commit political suicide by doing that. So forming together. All of the other parties have agreed to join together to keep the AFD out if necessary. Very democratic, and we are very similar in Australia, out of the typical two-party system for our independence. I said, can you tell me about the Russian-speaking battalions? So it's but of an open secret that there are a number of Bundeswehr infantry battalions that are manned heavily by Russian migrants and the Volga Deutsch, the ethnic German diaspora, who generally come from families that were settled in the Volga River area and were expelled or fled from the east post-1945. They are also in other parts of the Bundeswehr, to the point that it's difficult to get enough people with security clearances deployed on some specialist tasks, as a number of the soldiers have ties to Russia or Russian family members. This doesn't mean that you're some insider, but it can be very difficult for then your security clearances. There are guys who have like parents who were in bikie gangs or had been charged with something who will never get a security clearance because of the risk there. And I've had to take out some of this. It would be like Australia backing up France in a war against the UK. Suddenly we'd realise we're heavily compromised from within with our UK lateral transfer. So a lot of Brits come over to the Aussie Army, but if we were ever against there, you'd be looking over going, what are you thinking about? You never know. So I guess that is an interesting aspect to see for the entirety of Europe. And of course, we've seen where the AFD have that very nationalist outlook, and Germany first. And one thing I will say is a lot of these political parties are people that they will never get in. Never say never on some of that. I think there's a lot of Europeans sick to death with how things are going. And we could see, I always say, this is a big swinging dick, and the further left something swings, inevitably the further right something will swing. I'm also a big believer in the horseshoe theory, that the extreme left is very close to the extreme right as well. It's all authoritarian. It's all based on just emotions and feelings, not facts. If it's floating around the middle, you can add nuance to things, you can add science to things, but at the very extremes of this, you have extreme religious zealots, and you have extreme gender zealots as well, and it's a religion in itself, and we paint this with left or right, where I'd rather use progressive or postmodern and traditionalists, if that makes sense. But we need to go over Mark Rubio. Of course, he is Trump's pick for the Secretary of State, what he has said, and what Bloomberg is talking about what may be Putin's demands. Let's go over Mark Rubio first. I wish I could find a transcript of this, but I apologise. You're going to have to listen to it. You might get some echo because I have to listen to it my end as well. Can I speed this? No.
The matter is that in this conflict, there is no way Russia takes all of Ukraine. The Ukrainians are too brave and fight too hard, and the country is too big. That's not going to happen.
So, saying Russia, there's no way he will take all of Ukraine. We have said very similar to this. I also don't think Putin wants to take all of Ukraine either, because of how difficult that would be to police. Because if the front lines even fully collapsed, then you're going to end up with massive internal unrest as well if the faster you move. That's why we've said this attritional push forward limits that.
It's also unrealistic to believe that somehow a nation the size of Ukraine, no matter how incompetent and no matter how much damage the Russian Federation has suffered as a result of this invasion, there's no way Ukraine is also going to push these people all the way back to where they were on the eve of the invasion.
So saying they won't push them back to the eve of the invasion, I believe saying 22, not even 2014. Zelensky has said similar, that we don't have the military means to push this back, has to be done by diplomatic means. And in my opinion, I don't think there's any diplomatic means that at this point in time will push Russia to give up that territory that tens, hundreds of thousands of their men lay dead in. Of course, we look at protracted war, the larger the cost, then the less someone will want to then pay into that cost even further. Does that make sense?
Just given the size dynamic. I saw a quote recently, and I wish I could attribute to who it was, but the quote was, and I think it was very wise, where they said the problem that Ukraine is facing is not that they're running out of money, it's that they're running out of Ukrainians.
That is something which people need to speak on more. It's not that they're running out of money, that they're running out of Ukrainians. And this is what we hear, manpower, manpower, manpower. That's why I say don't listen to figures given out by Moscow or Kyiv or anyone in between. Mr. Rubio here, Senator Rubio, is saying running out of Ukrainians. We hear this manpower problem and the reluctance to drop that down to 18. Why the reluctance to drop that? Because of these guys, 18 to 25, they are the ones having children too for the future. But what I say is this is where there is this then not adding up problem, is because, well, if then you don't conscript these and then put them into the fire of battle. And you know me, I'm actually not one for conscription. I believe states and statesmen have the responsibility to set the state into a position where people will volunteer to fight. You don't have to conscript to fight. That's just my personal belief on that. And that can change a little bit if you're on offensive or defensive actions. But regardless, that saying that, well, this is the manpower paradox. If you don't put them in, you're going to lose more territory. But if you do put them in, you are risking that entire next generation.
There's a size differential here that's important. Now, what Vladimir Putin has done is unacceptable. There's no doubt about it.
So this war Putin has done is unacceptable. He says there's no doubt about it.
It has to end. And I think it should be the official policy of the United States that we want to see it end. Now, what that master plan looks like is going to be hard work. This is not going to be an easy endeavor. But it's going to require bold diplomacy. So
bold diplomacy and a realistic end, not just purely idealistic.
And my hope is that it could begin with some ceasefire, and in order to achieve objectives like the one that needs to occur in Ukraine, it is important for everyone to be realistic.
For everyone to be realistic. I think in many sectors here, you're not allowed to be realistic. I think so many people have banked their entire personality, their entire political future, entire online area around ideals that they don't want to then flip to realistic, even in the bottom of their guts, if they may know that it is true. You've seen my reporting change dramatically in the way I see situations. It's very difficult to look internally and go, I think that's bullshit, and I think that's bullshit, and I think what I said then was bullshit also.
There will have to be concessions made by the Russian Federation, but also by the Ukraine.
So there have to be concessions made by Russians and by the Ukrainians. Of course, Ukraine, I agree, they shouldn't have to make any concessions, but unless you are ultimately winning on the battlefield, you are going to most likely have to come to some concession. Is it fair? No. This is something that Zelensky and Friedman talk about, and I wish there was more push on that. But okay, then if you're not going to make concessions, how are you going to then win and have Russia have a massive throw their hands up and go, well, then we surrender?
And the United States lend itself there. It's also important that there be some balance on both sides. In essence, it will be difficult to achieve this objective of a ceasefire and ultimately a peace settlement.
But this is something we'll talk about. There's going to be a balance here. But Putin may be looking and going, if that is right, that there are acute manpower shortages, why would we stop until we're even in a better situation? Because if that is true, like it is looking, then the front line is going to get easier and easier and easier as that gets worse and worse.
Unless both sides have leverage. Putin's goal now is to have maximum leverage so that he can basically impose neutrality on Ukraine, retrofit, and come back and do this again in 4 or 5 years. And that's not an outcome I think any of us would favor.
So he's talking about Putin wants maximum leverage to enforce non-NATO neutrality on Ukraine and then to come back. Although I think if there was permanent non-NATO status, potentially neutrality, why would they come back? I just noticed this guy has amazing ears.
By the same token, I think it's important that the Ukrainians have leverage, but they also will have to make concessions to reach this agreement. It's going to be very difficult. This will not be easy. Conflicts of this nature that have historical underpinnings to it are going to require a lot of hard diplomacy and tough work, but that's something. So
talking that Ukraine need leverage so they get the best deal, but also that they're still going to have to come to some concessions. The problem is with the leverage at the moment is Ukraine does have some leverage. They're striking oil depots, oil spot prices and gas are changing, and they occupy some, 424 kilometers in Russia. But I just don't see this leverage being enough at this point in time for Russia, for Putin to lay in front a negotiation that he would be happy with, given the cards that he has on the table, that the American administration could ever actually accept, and that the Kyiv government could accept also, given all the messaging, given the cost of this. And it goes back to what I said about Russia leaving these areas. The higher the cost you have put in, the less you are likely, the less you are willing to then forego some of that. And both countries here have poured tens, hundreds of thousands of men into this war. And it's going to be very, very difficult for either side here to make concessions at this point, because both are seeing this as existential. Though the tide of the war has been shifting now for, I'd say, about 18 months, but we really didn't recognise until it started becoming more and more in the last 6 months. So this is from Bloomberg. Putin would demand Ukraine never join NATO in any Trump talks. By Bloomberg, January 15th. Russia will demand Ukraine drastically cut back military ties with NATO alliance and become a neutral state with a limited army in any talks with incoming US President Donald J. Trump. And we saw this as well in some of the released negotiations around limits on weapon systems. So you may have a weapon system that can fire 20 kilometres, but not 200 kilometres. Increasingly confident he has the advantage in the battlefield in Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin is determined to achieve his goal that Kyiv never join NATO, of course, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and limits are placed on its military capacity, said the people with knowledge of Kremlin thinking, who asked not to be identified because of sensitive information that might fall out of a window. But increasingly confident, well, look at the maps, and he will have a better idea about the Russian economy. If you want to watch a podcast on the economy, have a look below. But as long as his economy can stick together through this, I believe that he's right in this confidence, even if those oil depots and gas lines are being blown up. If it's saying that, yes, but we can still maintain it, then that confidence is correct. And people saying that because these are being struck, Ukraine has every card on the table, I'm sorry, but there is then 109,000 cards of square meters on the table also. Yes, Ukraine has some, Russia has some, but at this point in time, the goals of this are vastly different. Russia's goal is for Ukraine to never join NATO. Ukraine's goal is to return all that territory. And I believe Russia's goal here is a lot closer than Ukraine's, and requires then that can be diplomacy. I believe taking back the territory has to be militarily. I don't know. The Kremlin's position is that while individual NATO members may continue to send arms to Ukraine under bilateral security agreements, any such weapons should not be used against Russia or to recapture territory. So he's saying, apparently, that you can still send weapons from then individual countries, but these can't be used against Russia or to retake this territory. The hardline opening demands are almost certain to be unpalatable to Ukrainian leaders as the war nears the 3-year mark. And I believe the demands probably that will be put on the table may be unpalatable to the US administration also. That said, what does Mr. Trump see in this? Does it undermine the US's security guarantees around the world if it is a really bad deal? The Russian conditions also include keeping at least a de facto control of at least 20% that Russia holds of Ukraine, including the Crimean Peninsula annexed in 2014. Though Moscow is open to some territory swaps, some people said. So it's open to some of this. And I believe what this may be is the area that Russia occupy in Kharkiv to swap back for, say, an area in Kursk. Remember, Kharkiv is not in the demands that Putin made around the Swiss Peace Summit. But getting Ukraine to the table is going to be very, very difficult as well. We see this from RBC Ukraine. Ukraine's ban on direct talks with Putin remains in effect, from Ukrainian Minister Andriy Sybiha. That the decision to ban direct talks with Putin remain in force. So there is a ban for talks directly with Putin. A weird move, but okay. He says, yes, this decision is still in effect. As of today, the decision of the National Security and Defence Council is still in force. And if we see that lifted, that's going to be a sign that things are happening. But again, if we look at what Lavrov said, Russia's Minister of Foreign Affairs, I think that he may not actually be interested in talking with Ukraine, that he may just talk to the US. He said, we're not interested in talking to Brussels. We're not interested in talking to Europe. We want to talk to the US. And of course, the US can have a hell of a lot of leverage here. Well, it has all the leverage at this point in time with LNG imports, with weapons, with everything. And of course, they can lean on NATO massively. Trump said last week that a meeting with Putin is being set up. But of course, this meeting can't go through until Trump is in the White House. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in November appeared to soften his position on possible ceasefire while Russia still occupies territory, saying Kyiv should rely on diplomacy to recover land seized by Moscow. Now, I'm not sure how that's going to work. We haven't heard how that is going to be realistic and work also, or is it softening the blow for a ceasefire and soften that is going to be come under some area or some new border or right to self-determination? I do not know. The issue of territories, this is from Tatiana Statnova, founder of R-Politik Consultancy and a senior fellow at the Russian Eurasian Center. The issue of territories is not the main problem of the conflict. It has a much broader context, which apparently is still not fully understood in the West, pointing to Moscow's position on Ukraine's NATO bid. And this is something that is, I think, wrong. And I mentioned this before, that there's two sort of differences being fought here. Russia is trying to put Ukraine in a position, both with occupying areas, with taking resources, with strikes on the energy, to put them in such a bad position that they have to throw up their hands and go, okay, we won't join NATO. But where Ukraine is fighting is to try and take back those territories. So there's sort of two different objectives going here. It's not just territory. And I agree with Tatiana saying here, I think so many do not fully understand what Moscow's position is here. You don't have to agree with it, but if you want to analyse something, you have to go, how do they see it? If your two kids are in a fight and you think, I think little Maddie's all right, I think Maddie's correct, because bloody such and such over here punched him in the head, you have to go, well, how do both see this? You have to analyse like that, including all the way from that to a war, or else you're just going to end up with you're just going to end up filling yourself with propaganda and echo chambers. And this is why I'm not a fan of all the pages going over to Blue Sky, is because you're just going to end up in an echo chamber. You're not going to have a look at any differing opinions, but I think a lot of people don't want to do that because it is difficult. With the incoming US leader and top aides have shown little enthusiasm for a binding security guarantees for Ukraine, especially through NATO membership. Trump has talked about NATO membership in general, not only not being super stoked on enthusiasm for Ukraine, but also other NATO countries not pulling their weight. The country has received tens of billions of dollars of US and European military aid since Russia poured in troops. And if Russia walks away with 1% of this land and Ukraine is not in NATO, this will be seen as a Russian victory, no matter the cost that it did put onto the Russian people and Putin, because this is seen as existential, that, well, if it is existential, then the cost of war can be massive. Same as what we've seen in, then, say, the Second World War being acceptable, because if it's seen as existential as this, and that's what I've said, if I was Zelensky, I'd be calling out rhetoric from NATO leaders going, hang on, Mr. fucking Estonia, if you're saying this is existential to your country, you would be willing to send whatever you need. The rhetoric versus reality of what leaders are saying, I think most of them, primarily all of them, are somewhat full of shit. If the UK, Mr. Johnson, you believe this is absolutely existential, you would have no problem being like, see that fucking air defense system? Send that way. Ukraine's biggest concern, Ukraine's biggest concern is that a halt in fighting would allow Russia to regroup and strike again, which Kyiv said why it needs Western weapons and a sufficient army. No, this is why Kyiv says it needs to be in NATO. So then Article 5 gets enacted. It's nothing to do with Western weapons and sufficient army. There's a degree of that, but it needs NATO to come in if Russia does go back in. But on this other side, if you want to analyse, you have to the other side. Russia's going, but a halt in fighting, you join NATO. What's saying then? The whole of that is not going to come across what we see as our lands. Ukraine should be neutral, harmless, and under no circumstances an outpost for NATO or the US. NATO is an outpost for the US at the end of the day. People say, why does the US need to be in NATO? You hear a lot of US conservatives say this. Why don't we this? Because if the US, the most powerful country in the world militarily, economically, if they don't have an arm into Asia, Eurasia, then they are a sovereign island off the coast, missing, of course, the bulk majority of humans in the world across this area. And you won't stay at that top for very long, at least in my opinion. He's a Russian tycoon and Kremlin ally. This Konstantin Malefev said in an interview last month, it should have a tiny army by Ukraine, enough for Ukraine to protect its borders from refugees and carry out police functions, but not enough to fight with Russia. The neutral status should be enshrined in Ukraine's constitution. Of course, this is what we get at. What Putin is going to put on the table, I can't see the cost that Ukraine has had here, the messaging, the information, the physical costs on the front line, the hybrid actions, all of this. I can't see it ever being acceptable at this point in time. I think Ukraine need to have really big wins on the front line, but I don't think they can do that without massive mobilization 18 months ago, in line with what Mr. Zaluzny said. And as well, if a deal gets signed in this, I'm also not confident there's not going to be massive uprising internally either because of that cost. don't say it can't happen. Look into history in these areas. Just over a year ago, Putin conveyed to senior US officials via indirect channels that he could potentially consider dropping an insistence on neutral status for Ukraine. So Putin conveyed to senior US officials that he would drop insistence on neutral status and even abandon opposition to eventual NATO membership. This is what two people close to the Kremlin said at the time. So they eventually join NATO and not have to be neutral. Putin has continually used the threat of Ukraine joining NATO as a central justification for his invasion, and a report of a possible trial balloon was met with US skepticism. Again, what Putin sees is he sees Ukraine in NATO as existential for Russia, so therefore he is willing to pay the massive cost of which he is paying. And I think himself and a lot of others are justifying this that way and justifying that huge loss, not just the invasion, but the loss and also the invasion. Since then, Russia's military situation has improved as it advances along the front in Ukraine's east, but I thought in March they were out of missiles and weapons 3 years ago. That has emboldened Putin to take a firmer line. One of the people familiar with the current preparation said, so instead of then dropping neutral status and abandon opposition to NATO, that he's now taken a further line because he's improved his position. And this is because I think so many people looked at this idealistically instead of realistically and looked at it and somehow just forgot that this was a major player with massive stocks of weapon systems too. If we really thought that all the Soviet stocks were a few hundred missiles in the beginning, which we were sort of told... No, yeah, now as you look back, we're just so fucking stupid. But this also goes into what many said, including John Mearsheimer. Well, I disagree with him on a lot of points, but I agree on some others. He said at the end of 22, that was the high water line. Russia was in a bad way. They've been pushed back. They've been pushed out of areas. They had very large losses. They hadn't been able to rebuild their military like they have at this point. And they were abandoning some of these as well. That was the high water line. Don't let them get into a better situation as they are. And again, we know through Russia's history, they are very slow to stand up. But eventually they do stand up. And I believe that's what we've seen, the difference between end of 22 to the beginnings of 25, end of 24. To be sure, Ukraine still holds territory in Russia's Kursk region after a surprise incursion last year, a potential bargaining chip in Kyiv if Kyiv can keep it. Remember, Russia has returned more than half of this. It's sitting, as we showed before, at 424 kilometre squares, and that is same and or less than Russia occupying Kharkiv, which we have not heard them talk about occupying all of Kharkiv. So again, that chip, yeah, it's a card on the table, but it's a 3 of hearts. It's not an ace, as some people would like to sit it there. The one we can't measure, it's very difficult to measure, is how much of a card is these continual strikes on those depots, but also how much of a card is this moving 10, 20, 30 kilometre squares every couple of days and then enveloping areas like Velika Novosibirsk and other areas. Legends, I hope you have a great day. I need to go have a drink. I'm hot under this light. Look after yourself. I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.